Today I'm going to be talking about one of my favorite subjects in rare books and manuscripts. And the reason it's one of my favorite subjects is because it really is at the intersection of where you can make a genuine academic contribution and at the same time score a significant profit, something of great interest to us booksellers. And the topic I'm going to be discussing is Binder's Waste. Now, about a week or so ago on Instagram and TikTok, I said I would be discussing this fragment from the 11th century, which was removed from a bookbinding, in greater depth on YouTube. So here we are. So if you're not subscribing or following me on those two sites, I command you to do so. The link is below. This is more than 1,000 years old, so it is a fantastic example of Binder's Waste. If you can imagine, this was the time shortly after the time of William the Conqueror and the Battle of Hastings. So as they say, haste makes waste, I suppose. So I will be getting into more details of that a little bit later. First, let's generally define what is Binder's Waste, especially for people unfamiliar with the subject or term. Binder's Waste is essentially medieval or ancient manuscript fragments that during the 15th, 16th, 17th centuries, etc., were reused and recycled by bookbinders. So bookbinders were at the forefront of the recycling industry before those nice blue cans. And today we can find these fragments in books, especially when the covers fall off or the spines are worn or the guts of the bookbinding are revealed. And these fragments can often be either, first of all, manuscript or printed, and they can be quite important sometimes. You might find the sole surviving example of a lost medieval text, which would be a sensational discovery, let's say. I have a few examples here to show you how you might find a manuscript fragment. The first one is a book from 1601 on numismatics, and the cover has fallen off, sadly, but it has revealed in the spine here a manuscript fragment from the 14th or 15th century, something that perhaps looks like a ledger. Really requires some additional examination, and we can come back to that. These fragments were not only used to stuff the spines of books, but sometimes they were used for the entire cover. And here is a nice example, a very large one from the 14th century, which was clearly used as a bookbinding for a 15th century Italian ledger. Now, this is no longer in situ or in situ, as they say, like the Cole Porter song, you say in situ, I say in situ. So how do I know it was from a ledger? Because sometimes if it's with the book itself, it often gives localization and other clues, like in archaeology. And I always tell people, don't remove the fragments, leave them with the book, especially consult experts first. This particular example has two pink patches on the spine, which I'm familiar with, are often typical of Italian ledger books of the 15th century. So that gives me a little bit of a clue where it came from. And as I said, you can also find them completely in situ, such as this incunable from the 1490s or so, which has a binding clearly from the 14th century, still intact. So that's certainly worthy of some additional investigation. There are some remarkable discoveries that can be made in both manuscript and printed Binder's Waste, and these can often be incredibly expensive. I could probably relate a couple recent stories. In 2017 at the Stuttgart Book Fair in Germany, put on sale was a book entirely bound in a vellum leaf of the Gutenberg Bible. So a sensational find. Now, why would you say would a Gutenberg Bible be dismembered and be reused as a bookbinding? Well, after the Gutenberg Bible was printed, it was later supplanted, by other translations, such as the Lutheran translation. And in the 16th century and 17th centuries especially, the Gutenberg Bible was not revered like it is today. It seemed an outdated text. So this particular copy was dismembered. And this example retained one of those leaves. When this was put up for sale, it created chaos at the book fair, and you've never seen chaos until you've seen a bunch of book dealers wanting one item. And I think in those situations, according to the rules of the fair, it's almost like an auction system to be allowed to purchase it at the price. And a consortium of dealers purchased it eventually and sold it to Princeton University. I'm not privy to the final sale details, but I presume it was at least $250,000 or so for something of that importance. And the reason they bought it, and Eric White, the special collections curator there, has a wonderful blog post about it, which I'll put a link to below, is that it was with the book itself, so it gives localization to it. It also tells the story of this particular manuscript, of this particular Bible, and how it was dismembered. And of great interest to us booksellers is the possibility, the tantalizing possibility, that there are other Gutenberg Bible leaves being used as book bindings out there to find. So keep your eyes peeled for that particular font and that particular rubrication. Another recent major discovery was made by my friend Patrick Olson, a former special collections librarian who went rogue and became a bookseller himself. And I don't know where he bought this, maybe at auction. But he discovered with his eagle eyes in the bindings printed fragments from the Ars Minor of Aelius Donatus, so-called Donatus fragments. And those are particularly important because those can predate the Gutenberg Bible. The Gutenberg Bible was not the very first thing off Gutenberg's press. And these Donatus fragments are of great interest to early printing history. So a major and significant discovery, and congratulations to Patrick for that. And you can read his catalog description. I'll put the link below too. And as you'll see, it's also a six-figure fragment. So you can make a lot of money and make great discoveries at the same time with Binder's Waste. Now, this brings up the question, of course, where did all this waste come from? And I think during the period of transition from the manuscript to the printed book especially, you would bring an example of the manuscript to a printer or publisher, and once the printed book came out, there was not a great need or reverence any longer to preserve the original manuscript. And the material was still valuable, the vellum, and consequently it was recycled into bookbinding. So that was one major source of how they got into bookbindings. The other, of course, is through war and pillage, and they sometimes famously cite the dissolution of the monasteries in the 16th century in England, where many manuscripts were dispersed. So many so that they not only made their way into the hands of bookbinders, but probably even to fishmongers to wrap fish. There were so many of them. There is a nice letter, put that somewhere here, of Matthew Parker, written in 1565 to William Cecil, where he specifically talks about that. He says, the covetous stationers and how old books are being spoiled in apothecaries' shops. So in this example, we find old manuscript waste in apothecaries' shops. And we're lucky also to have the reformer John Bale, who wrote in the Laborious Journal, and he quotes in the 16th century in Old English, "I know a merchant man, which shall at this time be nameless, but he bought the contents of 2 noble libraries for 60 shillings price. A shame it is to be spoken." And he goes on to call it gray paper, the manuscript paper, and he says it's now being chiefly used for wrapping. So that is from John Bale. So as I said, you probably during the period would find these manuscript fragments in the hands of apothecaries and soap sellers and grocers and even fishmongers. But since today we can't go to East London and order cod and chips and hope that our fish is delivered wrapped in a fabulous medieval manuscript, we are stuck with the only source where we can reasonably find them, and that is in book bindings. So now I would like to talk about the wonderful manuscript fragment here. Now, when you find a fragment, you have to ask yourself, how do I know this is important, how old it is, and where is it from? 3 major questions, of course. And this, as I said, it's in a frame from about the 1920s or so, and somebody has written here an 11th century manuscript fragment the apocryphal Passion of Peter and Paul, and they cite Mr. M.R. James, who, by the way, was a great medievalist, and since Halloween is coming up, he was also a fantastic short story writer, an antiquarian short story writer of horror and ghost stories. So if you haven't read some short stories like the Mezzotint, they are well worth reading, especially at this time of year. Now, we can't always believe the dates attributed on old writing, and I can even tell you from booksellers tend to try and make some manuscript fragments that they find older than they actually are, because of course that increases the price. So we always want to be accurate with our assessment of the date. Now this really opens up into the field of paleography, paleo being ancient writing. Now, I am a bookseller, I'm not a paleographer. I have a keen interest and appreciation of these things and experience over the years, so I can often identify them, but sometimes I also have to consult outside experts to assist me naturally in these matters. So how do we go about verifying the date of a fragment like this, or a fragment that we may find in a book binding? Now, there are some excellent reference texts if you're not familiar with the subject, and you even can compare fragments to them. For instance, this one on historical scripts by Stan Knight with some beautiful photographs of everything, the minuscule, Gothic textura, so you can really start to date the manuscript fragments accurately by close comparison with the photos. For myself, I like to think first in the general terms of the development of historical script. That often helps me. And I go about by thinking of the 8th century and what they call the invention of the Caroline or Carolingian minuscule. This was during the period of the Emperor Charlemagne, who came to the throne as Holy Roman Emperor in about 800, appointed by Pope Leo III. There's so many Pope Leos, I easily forget them. We should just make Leonardo DiCaprio Pope, and then we'll be done with all Pope Leos. But during this period, which was the first time, I think, since the breakup of the Roman Emperor and the schism between the East and the West, that there was a sufficient number of literary people over this wide geographical area that they really required a common script to read. So the Caroline minuscule was developed. It's a very elegant, beautiful, and spacious script, and very legible to modern eyes, because it's almost, I think, Times New Roman was even based on it. So you can certainly read Caroline minuscule. That's one part of the spectrum. On the other end of the spectrum is what I would call Gothic script, which tends to be much heavier, much more angular, much more laterally compressed, and much more difficult for modern eyes to easily read. Now, between those two bookends is a period, I would say, from about 1075 to the early 1200s, which was a transitional period, what they call like Proto-Gothic, where we started to get away from this elegant Caroline minuscule, and it started to develop some Gothic elements over different geographic areas. And that transitional period is particularly fascinating. So when I see a manuscript potentially from that period, I say to myself, well, is it closer to the Caroline minuscule, or is it closer to the Gothic text? And in this particular example, it really retains a lot of elegance of the Caroline minuscule, clearly not pure Caroline minuscule, and it starts to diverge from that. But I think that certainly puts it in that transitional period at the earlier part, which would go along with the date assigned here of the 11th century, which I think is quite accurate. Now there, of course, is the localization. Now, along with the date, some of the things we look at in paleography, if you're not familiar with the technical terms, are things like ascenders, how the lines go up, descenders, how the letter forms go down, ligatures, how things are connected, or as well as, I would say, serifs, decorative elements. And all of these things can assist us, again, with proper reference material for comparison in terms of its not only dating, but localization. And when I study this, I believe that the manuscript was probably written in Germany, although, again, I would have to consult another expert to really make me comfortable with my analysis of it. now finally we get to the text itself, which sometimes you can encounter a minor text, which is of relatively modest importance, a medieval text that's been constantly written over the centuries, or something particularly interesting like this text, I believe. This again is the apocryphal Passion of Peter and Paul. So this was a 5th century pseudo-epigraphical text, I think they call it, that was not part of the Gospels, but was developed later. And the earliest surviving examples we have, I think, come from about the 5th century, from the Codex Ambrosianus, if I remember. And it is a fine example of what we call textual transmission, because this particular text was written from at least the 5th century until the medieval ages. It makes its way all the way into the Golden Legend of Jacobus de Varenne, which was often used as a source for medieval paintings, and they will even paint what's actually written in this text here. So a wonderful example of textual transmission. I particularly like it as well because it is the story of Simon Magus, the prototypical black magician, a major figure of the occult, and the man who Dante threw headfirst into the pit of hell. I don't know if it matters if you go headfirst or tail first or do somersaults. If you are Simon Magus, you are going into hell. And it basically tells the story of Simon Magus and the Emperor Nero, who Simon tried to demonstrate his supernatural powers and divinity, and eventually he fell in failing to attempt that. And that's actually what's depicted oftentimes in medieval and Renaissance paintings, the fall of Simon Magus, again probably from the Golden Legend itself that this eventually was taken into. And it's very easy text to read for the identification itself. We can read some of the Latin here. Tunne nero ad Simoni dixet, quida Simon, putto victi sumo Simon dixet. So I can translate that to you. I even wrote out a little English translation here to make it easier. And it says, then Nero said to Simon, what is it, Simon? I think we are defeated. And he says, if you let this magician do such a thing, the great magician of your country will grow up and will overthrow your kingdom from its state. And of course it goes on in the rest of the translation there from the Latin. But again, it is a wonderful fragment because I love the whole story of the great Simon Magus. Now, finally, there is always the question of, well, I am a bookseller. What do I price this at? Because, of course, I'm coming up to the Boston International Antiquarian Book Fair, and maybe you'll stop by and see me in November, and I have to put this in the catalog. And sometimes when things are unique and desirable, either I can underprice them, I can overprice them. There's no strict comparisons, and only if someone buys them is that a validation of my opinion. I think I'm going to put a price on this of $12,500 or so because I think it is a really exciting medieval fragment. And again, I don't know if nobody will take it, in which case I will be glad to keep it on my wall, or if I'll get 10 orders for it instantly, which can happen because I've underpriced it. And in this particular case, I think it's going to go quickly because I have so much enthusiasm and excitement about it. And I think when that's the case, my passions are often shared by other buyers. So that is the fragment, and I hope that is a fine example of the treasures that you can discover in Binder's Waste. And I hope that you've enjoyed this video and you'll tune in for other videos about the rare and antiquarian book trade.